to me, I view governance as a process, as a way that a business or a human being handles his minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day life in terms of how it does things, what its rules and regulations are, and depending on who it is, whether it's a one-man show or one-woman show or thousands of people, depending on the size of the company or organization has a management structure or a board or some sort of a operating structure that from its own internal rules decides how it functions and how it operates.
Yeah.
And so corporate governance is basically the rules and procedures and methods that a company, or once again, an individual or a partnership or whatever it is, decides as to how it's going to run and operate its minute to minute, day to day, week to week business.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to establish early on that that is something that's parallel to, but quite different than the actual performance of a business, which is measured by profit and loss or revenue or other things that can be valued as important. It all depends on how the company is run and who is making those decisions. If it's a small company, it might be a founder or a CEO or whatever. If it's a larger company, it could be a management committee or a board. And so what has to be established as the company evolves is how the company wants to be positioned in the marketplace and how it wants to be perceived in terms of what it's doing. So if it is aiming to become a public company and be listed on a stock exchange, those kinds of companies have certain sets of rigid rules and procedures that must be adhered to in order for them to be considered to be asked to be members of some sort of a public company. Other companies are private companies and they don't have the same kind of regulations. So depending on what they want to do and how important it is for them for their appearance in the marketplace, the governance is really determined as part of the overall, and the word that I always like to use is the intended outcome. The
Mm-hmm.
company or individual or board or something has to determine an intended outcome. And if you are in a car, or if you're in an airplane, or you're in a train or a bus, your intended destination is where you want to end up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is your destination or outcome. And how you get there is the corporate governance is basically a set of rules and procedures and methodologies that the people that are running the company established that is visible on a minute to minute, hour to hour, day by day basis to the marketplace, their customers, their employees, their investors, etc., as to how they are operating and how they are moving toward achieving their intended outcome. And so at the end of the day, the governance is how a company is viewed in the marketplace as operating and achieving its goal. And that can be very similar to or dramatically different
Mm.
than the profit and loss. And because there's lots of companies that operate and are very profitable, but their governance is extremely questionable.
Mhm.
And so, depending on what is important and what kind of company it is, that's sort of how I view it. A failure of corporate governance is directly related to how the company achieves or does not achieve its intended outcome
Okay.
or its goals.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, if you are in San Francisco and you want to drive to New York City 3,000 miles, your intended outcome is New York City.
Hmm.
And you look at a map.
Yeah.
So if you are starting, if you're in a business that's doing whatever it is in whatever industry,
Hmm.
if you have an outcome or a goal or a budget or a projection,
Hmm.
and if you don't achieve that goal or projection or outcome, there's really two, maybe three major reasons. And governance is not necessarily one of them. I mean, I don't think that if you take a look and read the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or business papers, I'm not sure that you will see a lot of headlines blaming corporate governance
Yeah.
using those terms
Mhm.
as the reason as a major company failed. It had a bad business schedule, or what it was doing wasn't meeting the needs of a market.
Okay.
So governance has to be very closely tied into and married to the outcome and projections of how a business is put together. And these are usually done by the same people, whether it's the lead, the CEO, the board, or whatever, whoever is managing the company.
Hmm.
And from the beginning, every organization that's getting new funding, you've got people that are writing the early checks. You've got people that are the senior management, the CEO or president or executive VP. And then you've got investors, and those are mostly different. They might be the same,
Yeah.
but assuming that you have a management team
Hmm.
that's responsible for making decisions,
Hmm.
and got investors who have representation on a board,
Hmm.
and then the company has to make a decision whether it meets its board monthly, quarterly, whatever it is. At the end of the day,
Hmm.
this is how the company is deciding to set up its governance. How is it going to get from point A, where it is today, to point B, where it wants to be in a month or 3 months or a year? And then the other question, those are the goals and budgets or outcome. And
Hmm.
then governance is what are the rules and procedures
Hmm.
that the company itself and its management team has established to have the company run, operate with that set of rules and procedures. And that's how I sort of see governance. I have had 10 startups, and I don't know if it's an embarrassing thing to say. I don't think I've ever had the term about at meetings with the senior management or board, how do we want to define our governance? I think our governance is defined by the quality and integrity and type of value system that everyone who is leading the company has. And at the end of the day, that is sort of where the governance comes from. And, there's a term, bad apples. Certain people are bad people.
Mm-hmm.
And they get into positions of leadership of large companies, lead a company in a bad direction that ends up with a bad result. And depending on how you measure governance and how that relates to outcome and P&L and revenue, those are very directly related issues.
Mm-hmm.
So governance and et cetera are all sort of part of I think, a much larger picture. Um, you've asked a very quick, concise question, and the answer is extremely complex and psychological, and you might even add the word spiritual, in the fact that at the end of the day, the world that we are living in 2023, and I'm going to use the adjective unfortunately, if you
Mm-hmm.
don't, is being uh, influenced more than any time in my life by the absolute pursuit of money. And money is equated with power. And so if you take a look at the large decisions that are being made politically around the world, and I think that because so much has happened, I think there's some real major bad decisions that are being made. And if you don't mind, um, I think I have a good friend who sent me a link to a book that I read yesterday.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Great Unraveling, Navigating the Polycrisis of Environmental and Social Breakdown. And what this basically is saying is the fact that there's real problems in the world because business leaders from large governments and corporations are overlooking the planet and doing good for people and making decisions that will generate short-term profit. And so therefore you have carbon in the air, you have a lot of problems. And if you can take a look over my shoulder, you'll see 17 SDGs. If you take a look on my sweater, I have the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are things that have been together since the year 2000 to talk about areas of helping the world. There's also a large measure called ESG, environmental, social, and governance, that out of nowhere about 2 or 3 years ago started to get prominence in large companies and investing firms, that was more than just profit and loss. And so there is a sort of a larger issue of a conflict between a company doing good and making a profit. And the doing good has always been looked at as a soft thing, but at the end of the day, it's not doing good or doing bad. It's having a whole set of values. And corporate governance is a major variable that can be used either way, depending on the leadership of the company, its investors, and its long-term outcome to help regulate and guide the performance of the company or the lack of performance. Because at the end of the day, the governance is how an organization is running. What are the rules it is following? And, it is in a, I'm just trying to think of something that might be, it's almost like a parent giving a child, when they're becoming a teenager, some rules as to how they should act. That's what how should a company act? And at the end of the day, it's all an integral part of the intended outcome or the expected results that the people that own the company or investing in the company want to achieve. So I think, from my point of view, corporate governance is a very intimately and directly tied variable once a company has its investors, its board, as to how the company is going to act and manage the journey in order to get from point A to point B, because point B is what the board decided where it wants to go. And so, I don't think you can separate those two, because how you get there and where you're going, if you're going to the wrong place, how you get there is irrelevant. You're going to end up in the wrong place. At the end of the day, you have to agree as the leaders or board or management team of what your intended outcome is. I think the guiding principle is, what do you hope to achieve? And governance is a definition of defining how you get there in a lot of different ways. And so if your objectives are not legal, or they're not healthy, or they're not proper, how you get there, I think, is much less important than where you're trying to go. And so I think the whole governance issue, depending on what kind of company and who are the investors and what are the objectives, are all tied together, because at the end of the day, the most important, how you get there. For example, if you want to go to a wedding and you're supposed to dress in a tuxedo, and you get very dressed, then that's your procedure. But if you end up at the wrong wedding, you look good, you've had good governance, but you didn't achieve your goal. And so I think there has to be, I don't think that governance can be separated from corporate objectives and all of the other things, because at the end of the day, depending on what your objectives are from a P&L point of view, or a revenue point of view, or a market penetration point of view, there might be certain things you cannot achieve, or are very difficult to achieve, with certain limitations set by governance. And I'm very glad to go into the detail of that. But the other word that's very, very integral to that is values. So the values of your leader are basically major building blocks and components of his or her governance as to how it's going to be created. And if you have a 5-person board or a 3-person board, the combined values of that board are going to be very closely integrated to what your governance is, because you're going to get together when you start, or quarterly, or whenever that is, and set the rules and procedures for how you want your company to operate. And operations and governance are very, very closely tied in together.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter, I think it's much more fine tuning. I mean, if you're going in a really bad direction relative to what you got, there's a major mistake being made. Someone screwed up
Yeah.
because they weren't watching,
Yeah.
so it's a very short question, but it's a very deep, profound question. And thank you for asking it. There's a we're talking in here, and I'm going to have to get into a very large subject called nonprofit or profit. And the most people in the world feel that when you define doing good, you're thinking the company is going to be a nonprofit. Mostly that. And at the end of the day, there are large efforts that are being made to do good in a for-profit environment. And I don't want to mention the name of this person, but I'm involved with a project that someone was the CEO of one of the largest foundations in the United States for 18 years. And he left a couple of years ago because he felt that only being in the nonprofit environment was not giving him enough firepower to make the changes that he wanted to make. And so I think right now, what's happening is there is hopefully, and that's an integral part of what I'm doing, a marriage between doing very globally dynamic, important things that achieve very positive outcomes and making profit. Because if you separate those two, it's a very different variable. And I think the whole corporate governance is part of the procedure of how one gets to the place that you're going. If you're in Los Angeles and you want to drive to DC and you don't have a map, is it important that you drive the most efficient way, the quickest way, or is the most important thing that you get there? And I think that and I think corporate governance is something that has to be parallel to and follow along with intended outcome. Because if you set a rule of corporate governance and say you can't make any more than 12 left turns an hour, you might not get to your destination, or you have to do this kind of thing or that kind of thing. So I think it's very important that your corporate governance is respectful for your value system, for your intended outcomes, for what you're wanting to do. And if I can I think, introduce a word that I think I've discussed with you, but I think it's a very important word in here. It's called chaotic. And most large companies have a destination and they want to go. And back in 1970, before you were born, there's a gentleman named D. Hock who founded Visa International. And he did it chaotically because at that time there was three major credit card companies, American Express, Diners Club, and Carte Blanche. And it was very difficult for a normal citizen who wanted to travel globally to get a credit card that was accepted in Japan or France or Brazil because of all kinds of rules. Because and so what he did is he had a long-term objective of having a credit card that could be accepted by everyone in the world, in all countries and all currencies and all income. And he could not define what the rules were. So he could not have corporate governance, but he had a set of values. And he created what became the largest credit card in the world. And he did it. It's the combination between chaos and order. The order was he had a clear goal. I want to set up a credit card that everyone in the world can use, that lives by all of the rules, but it was impossible to outline how he got there because it had never been done before. And I think that's one of the things that's an interesting challenge. How do people who want to achieve results that have never been achieved before get there? And how important is it that they adhere to a rigid set of governance standards when they have values and they might have to move a little bit? So the most important thing is you have values and integrity and everything else and clear objectives, and then continue to be moving in the direction that you hope to achieve. And so it could be years or decades of chaos, but at the end of the day, hopefully, you will achieve the order that you want by getting to your destination. So at the end of the day, and these are things that companies or individuals have to put values on, as long as you have a set of values and you don't violate them, how you get there, to me, is not that important, or how long it takes, or how many left or right turns or U-turns you make. It's the fact that you get to where you want to go. So I think that one of the things is the governance has to be in parallel with and moving with corporate goals and objectives and values. So, from a rigid governance, so I think it's very difficult to combine all of these things. Okay. Children and people living in inner cities everywhere in the world need to solve basic problems about their daily lives. And if the way that those problems are solved have to adhere to a rigid set of standards, it, by definition, I think, will make it more difficult, expensive, and take longer to get the objectives than if the most important thing, as long as they're doing things that are legal and moral and ethical, how they get there is much, that's something that many smart people will debate a lot. So I feel very strongly about that.